Okay. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Hello, Antonia. And Antonia says, hi, Anthony, looking forward to this. You've already got very enthusiastic students.
That's great. I'm not surprised.
So let's get started, shall we?
Sure. So
thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another session of our ongoing seminar of English literature at Facultad de Letras UC. Thank you to Bleni and to Facultad de Letras for organizing, hosting this session. I am particularly pleased to introduce our guest today, since he visited Chile in person in 2014 for the Summer Literature Conference. And on that occasion, he spoke to us about Poe, Poe's tales of horror, vampiric love stories, Poe and Baudelaire. And I also remember a very interesting session on 9-inch nails and Poe. Dr. Tony Magistrale is professor of English at the University of Vermont. He specializes in American literature and is the author of 23 books and 70 academic articles. He has received numerous teaching awards. And in his studies, he has focused especially on Anglo-American Gothic from the 18th century to contemporary manifestations in popular culture, including the work of Stephen King. He's also a published poet, and I remember when he was here, he wrote a poem on Santiago, which was published in the ESLA journal, so you can look it up. His most recent book is entitled The Great Illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe, published by Anthem Press, which offers an introduction to the most important illustrators, and there are apparently 700 total worldwide, inspired by the tales and poems of Poe. And that is what Dr. Magistrale will be lecturing on today. You'll have a chance to ask questions at the end, but also Dr. Magistrale told me that if you want to interrupt, you may. So that's also open. So thank you so much again for being with us, Dr. Magistrale. It's wonderful to have you in Chile, as it were, virtually. Vermont is in our same time zone, so at least there's that, a certain closeness. And now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Francisca, thank you so much for inviting me, and to all of your students who are out there behind closed doors. I'm so sorry that the pandemic is still affecting Chile so harshly. I hope very strongly that things will improve in the coming days. And I hope that some of that improvement will come at the hands of the United States as we share the success of our vaccine story with you folks in Latin America. It's my pleasure to be here. It's my pleasure to see Francisca again, because we haven't really had a chance to actually see face to face in 7 years since the last time I was here. But I'm delighted to be able to share with you a project that has taken place over the span of about 5.5 years. The reason it's taken so long is because I've been teaching at full time. I've had a sabbatical in that interim, where a sabbatical means that I've had a year off where I've been able to work on this project and get a lot done with it. The person who co-wrote the book with me is a former graduate student of mine who wrote her master's degree on the great illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe. And 5 years or so ago, this is where the idea came to us, because there are no books. There is no single text that's out there that actually deals with the great ones. Obviously, this could be a book that could have been 600-700 pages long if we would have moved beyond the 25 or 26 illustrators that are represented in this text. But we decided to limit our scope to the ones that are most well known, but also to the ones that probably did the best work on Edgar Allan Poe. which means that there are some real limits to this. I would have loved this book to have gone on, but 5 years is enough. There are other things to do besides writing about the great illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe. So if everyone can hear me, I'm going to shift to the shared screen and begin the presentation. Okay, can everybody see that? All right, it's a good place for me to begin by reminding those of you who don't know already that Edgar Allan Poe is one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous writers from American literature. And when we talk about the impact that Poe had on the world, it's enormous. Maybe only Walt Whitman measures up to Poe's fame and impact in terms of all the great art that's been out there. I'm talking visual art, but I'm also talking music, dance, television, and film as well. All of these things have been impacted strongly by a man who died in 1849. And I thought I'd start with this picture because Edgar Allan Poe is also the mascot for the Baltimore Ravens, which is an NFL American football team. And just as a quick aside, in the beginning of every game before the Baltimore Ravens take the field, Edgar and Allan, which are the two mascots, take the field, and up on the Jumbotron above the stadium, the Raven, the poem The Raven, appears for everyone to either recite or at least appreciate. So that's the start of the impact on people who know nothing about Edgar Allan Poe other than he died in Baltimore in 1849 and is really one of the great former citizens of that city. All right, let's see if I can get this to move now. Okay. The very first, well, not the first, but certainly the most famous early illustration of Edgar Allan Poe were all based on the Raven, because the Raven held a special place for artists in Poe's universe. It began not through art, but through literature. Charles Baudelaire, who was probably the single most famous poet in French history, spent 20 years translating Poe's stories into French. His colleagues, Mallarmé did the poetry and Valéry did the essays. In the process of translating this, all of this was happening in the late 60s, early 70s, 1860s, 1870s. There was much interaction among artists in France. And one of the interactions that took place was between Mallarmé, who translated all of Poe's poetry, and Manet, Edward Manet, the great artist in the early part of, in the latter part of the 19th century. These are illustrations that come from 1875. And this is, Mallarmé convinced Manet to do some sketches, and he ended up doing, I think, 7 of them based on the Raven. And this is the first one, that portrait of the poet sitting alone in his chamber. Now, the first thing I have to point out about this is that Manet's treatment of Poe's poem is quite different than the poem itself. Manet was interested in not only creating an illustration that would somehow speak to the poem, but also connecting it to his own art. And this is one of the things that I learned most clearly when I was writing this book, is that Poe had a tremendous impact, of course, on all of these artists. But at the same time, the artists reflect in the creation of these visual images of Poe their own time, their own artistic flavor and genre. So here we have, in 1875, Manet producing a version of Poe that is highly reflective of his own place and time. And the thing that I would draw your attention to is over here, for starters. Poe's artistic figure, the image of the narrator, is a man who's very much isolated. He's very typical to Poe's universe. But Manet wanted instead to create an image of the narrator who seemed to be somehow connected to society. Now, in Poe's poem, there is no reference of a city. There's no reference of, for example, a top hat and a cane, a man who is a figure of the crowd. And here, Manet includes that image in the very first drawing. This is the second drawing that Manet did of the raven. In Poe's poem, we never have a sense of place. The raven could be taking place anywhere. We only know that it's in a single room. But I want to call again your attention to what Manet did in creating a cityscape. So that top hat and cane are reflective not only of Poe's isolation with the narrator, but also of his place in the center of an urban scape. Now, this is very unique, very different, very un-Poe-like, and in fact speaks instead to the 1870s that Manet was most interested in capturing, because Manet was one of the first painters to draw on street life. He was interested and fascinated with the image of the bourgeoisie, of the emergent middle class, and that figure that perhaps you've heard this term before, that figure of the flâneur, a man of the crowd, a man who belonged to the city. And here you see a really interesting image that breaks very clearly from what Poe was doing in the creation of his character in the poem. I'm just going to stop for a minute and show you a Manet painting. This is Music in the Tuileries. And these are the kinds of painting that Manet did during his lifetime. He was very much a figure of the bourgeoisie. He was interested in capturing the fashion and the dynamism of the crowd. And this is a perfect example of him. And he did this painting about the same time as he was illustrating the raven for his friend Mallarmé. That's just a detail from the painting, and I picked it because I wanted to show you again that hat, that bowler hat that you see in the beginning of Poe's, of Manet's drawing of Poe. To continue back, this is the figure again of the narrator looking up at the raven, who's perched up here on the bust of Pallas as the figure resides in his chamber. Again, if I could draw your attention to the composure of this figure, it's not like it is in the poem, where it's very clear that the figure of the narrator is, by the end of the poem, very upset with the existence of the raven in his room, but rather has a kind of interchange or a kind of comfort level as he's talking with and about the raven itself. And this is the last print from Manet's drawings of the raven. And again, very interesting, isn't it? How the figures seem to become discorporated. Here you have the figure of the poet or the voice of the narrator here. See his body outlined here in shadow. And here is the bird with the beak here, even as it's disappearing into this kind of smoky hue that's done with charcoal. And I think that one of the things that's most important is the way in which in 1875, the year when Manet produced these drawings, you have an anticipation almost of symbolism, where the figures are withdrawn and actually disappear, turn into some sort of spiritual essence. The reality of the existence of the narrator becomes disembodied. And so too does the raven itself, taking on enormous dimensions, as you see here, even larger than the figure of the poet. And that would in some way correspond to Poe's poem, because that's what happens at the end of Poe's poem with the raven, is that the figure of the speaker or the narrator becomes smaller as the importance of the raven grows in length. Okay. Shortly thereafter, in 1883, Gustave Doré, who is another Frenchman, obviously capturing and building on what he saw going on in Manet's work, because Manet had produced this portfolio on the raven, began his own series of drawings, also in pen and ink, that were done on the raven, the importance of that poem to the symbolists and to the great artists that come at the end of the 19th century, including Van Gogh, who also was strongly influenced by Poe, as well as Walt Whitman. I'm reading a book right now called Vincent's Books, and I discovered that he was very fond of Walt Whitman, and I did not know that. I knew he was interested in Poe, but also Whitman. But this is Doré. And again, there are 23 lithographs that Doré produced in the course of his rendition of the Raven. And I'm just going to show you a few of them. This is, again, one of those images from the poem where the poet, who's very clearly in a position where he's isolated and secluded in his chamber, unlike in Manet's case, where we see him almost on the verge of going out into the city, is lamenting the loss of his love, Lenore, who of course is figured down here on her gravestone. This is another image from Doré's Raven. Yes, someone wanted to add something, or was that just a sneeze? Okay, let me go on.
Tony, I have a question.
Yes,
I typed it into the thing, but I'll ask you. This is Mike. I noticed they're all black and white. Chiaroscuro is because, are they doing this because of the drama that it creates in the image, or is it because it's too expensive to do things in color in an illustration in one of these books?
It's a really good question, Michael. I think it's probably the latter, because the color images of Poe really don't begin until you get to the 20th century. The 19th century is full of, as you say, the chiaroscuro images in black and white. And I think that when you're talking about producing, especially more than just a single portfolio, but rather reproductions of the portfolio, the black and white was cheaper to produce.
Okay, fine. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Okay, so here again is the figure of the Raven. Let me put you up here. You can see the figure up here on top of the bust of Pallas. And here's the narrator. Unlike Manet's narrator, who's very composed and very calm, he's raving at the Raven. You can see him accursed at the Raven. As the poem goes on, he becomes more and more animated about, I'm sure most of you know that poem already, so I won't spend a lot of time with the poem. But here is that figure of Lenore over here on the right as a kind of ghost-like presence, or perhaps the muse, the figure of the poetic inspiration that inspires this. This is a close-up that Doré did of the Raven on the bust of Pallas. And I want to draw your attention especially to this cantilevered series of images of the lost Lenore. I hope I have another picture of that. Let me see if I do. No, I don't. I'm sorry. But Doré also did a very close image of all of these figures, all of these faces, as if to say that this is the way in which her presence is going to haunt the great romantic, because he can't get over the loss of this image of his beloved. And the Raven seems in some way to be responsible for that, as though he's produced this kind of dramatic imagery that continues and deepens the pain that the Romantic poet feels in witnessing the loss. There are 23 of those, so I would encourage you to go look at them all. I included probably about 7 of them in the book itself. But I want to move on. I don't want to, I mean, you could see the problem that I have in creating this book. I could spend the entire book talking about Manet and Doré and the French, but there are lots of stuff to talk about here. This is also 1882, again, another French artist by the name of Redon. This is entitled "The Eye Like a Strange Balloon Proceeds Towards the Infinite." This was based on, several of Redon's work were based on Poe. They don't speak terribly specifically about the stories. It was more like Poe influenced and inspired and created these images. Maybe there's a reference here somewhere with Antarctica, perhaps down here. Those of you living in Chile can identify perhaps. And of course, all through Poe's work, there are eyes. Think of something like the Telltale Heart as a good example. These are lithographs that are actually in the Chicago Institute of Art. All of these Redons, there are about 7 or 8 of them. And I was able to make an appointment with the people in Chicago and to actually go see these, and handled them with gloves, with white gloves, as I looked at these, because of course they're over 100 years old and they're made of charcoal. They're prints, they're charcoal creations. And this is another one of Redon's. This is based on the poem "The Bells." And nowhere in Poe do we see a skeleton ringing the bells, but it's close. Now, this is a good point for me to talk about a pivotal change that takes place in the illustrated work of Edgar Allan Poe. The 19th century primarily belonged to the French, at least in terms of their appreciation and their fascination with Poe. Definitely it was The Raven, but it was also some of Poe's other poetry, because the people who were being drawn to Poe were primarily poets and artists themselves. And even the artists who were not poets were being influenced by the symbolists and by the decadents at the end of the 19th century. So if I could generalize about what was happening at the end of the 19th century, it was this sense of Poe as a poet, his connection to symbolism, and his connection to the ethereal qualities of romanticism and symbolism that attracted the illustrators. When we turn the corner into the 20th century, other nationalities begin to illustrate Poe as well as the French. And their fascination isn't only with Poe's poetry and The Raven, although The Raven continues right through to our present day in terms of its impact on artists. What changes is, as you enter into the 20th century, we begin to notice a more realistic and psychological appreciation of Poe's work. So that it's not just this romantic sense of loss that comes with the death of a maiden, or loss that comes with a poetry that's centered in romanticism, but other Poe work, far more than the poetry, establishes itself. So in 1909, an Italian by the name of Alberto Martini begins to produce a series of black and white drawings of Edgar Allan Poe's work. This is all done in 1909, near the end of Martini's life. And these images are available in a place called the Pinacoteca di Martini, which is located just outside of Venice, along with literally hundreds of other images that Martini produced during his lifetime that were essentially critiques of war, the Catholic Church, despotism. It's almost as if Martini anticipated the rise of fascism in 1909. And this has no Poe title. It's simply based, like Redon's work, on a Poe image that he decided to draw. This could be any of Poe's women, really. It could be Lenore from The Raven, but it could also easily be Morella or Madeline Usher or Ligeia. If you know those short stories that Poe produced mostly in the early late 1830s, early 1840s. But again, you know, that sense here too of her wandering the hall. If you know Madeline Usher, who says nothing in the course of the short story, but just wanders ghost-like, wraith-like as she moves through the Usher mansion. That's a good image for her. As many of you know, and those of you who have studied Poe and his impact on Latin America, Poe was particularly influential on Latin American detective fiction. And this is an illustration, again by Martini, done in 1909, based on the short story Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the very first detective story that was ever written. Poe, as I'm sure some of you already know, invented the detective tale. And this was the first one. It's a story of orangutan. That's what this is right here. An ape that gets loose and creates havoc in the upstairs apartment of a money changer and her daughter. This is Madame España and her daughter, Camille. You only see her feet over here. It's almost like the witch in the Wizard of Oz. You just get to see the toes. But here, a more graphic image of Camille, who is about to be stuffed up a chimney after she's had her throat cut. And I think I spend a lot of time in the book talking about this image and the way in which it connects to images of racism and racial textuality that Poe was working with in Masque of the Red Death, but also that Martini was able to capture here in this image. And around her, of course, you can see all the accoutrements of femininity, the comb, scissors, makeup. Again, Martini, this based on the short story, The Telltale Heart, with its focus on the eye of the old man that so vexed the narrator that he became obsessed for a week over the image before he murders. So immediately you begin to see, I think, the difference between the 19th century with its emphasis on Poe's romanticism and poetry and the 20th century that moves into a realm of not only color. Here you go, Mike. Here's the start of color. This is from Ernest Blumenschein's The Black Cat, also 1909, so early on. But again, the focus here becomes more psychological, more involved with the horror element in Poe's fiction, less involved perhaps with the romantic element. And if we could just linger for a few minutes here on this image, one of the things that drew my attention immediately was the way in which this image seems to be appropriated from German Romanticism, and especially German Expressionism, with the entire earth kind of mirroring the the act that's being done here, the infamous act that's being done in the hanging of this cat. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Sorry. Go back. In the foreground, you see the narrator, who, again, they're always nameless in Poe, the narrator's house. And it is almost as if the earth and sky are mirroring the depravity that's being represented here. The tree as well, twisted and blasted, almost suggesting as if the narrator has committed some sort of heinous act against nature itself, which is a big part of what I think Poe was doing in this short story. He was creating a concept that he would work with all through the rest of his fiction. The Black Cat is early, 1830s. And what Poe was trying to do, I think, in a lot of these paintings, or sorry, a lot of these stories, was to create a kind of psychological breakdown in his characters. Poe was perhaps the first writer in literature to talk about mental illness. And that perhaps what we have here is an example of mental illness. A man who is not only psychologically unnerved, but also addicted to to perversity and to self-medication in his alcoholism. And I think that what Blumenschein manages to do here is to create an image that's in flux, that shows the kind of breakdown that's happening here. And I want to draw your attention, if I could, to this hat that has fallen off of his head, perhaps indicating the level of bestiality, the loss of civilization that is witnessed in this act of brutality against this helpless animal. And perhaps it is the open circle here too, indicating the scream, because don't forget, Munch's image of the scream occurs in the last part of the 1890s. So Blumenschein would have had the opportunity to see that image. And perhaps the suggestion being perhaps that there's a kind of silent scream that's going on here as well. Maybe the cat itself is screaming with its open maw, but we don't see here because the hirsute man is covered in hair and a black coat. But all of these things, I think, designed to reflect psychological complexity and psychological breakdown that Poe became famous for, but also influenced so strongly the illustrators in the 20th century. Because remember, until the 20th century, Poe was virtually unknown everywhere except in France. The French were the ones who discovered Poe largely because of their poets, Baudelaire, Mallarmé. And when we get to the 20th century, there's an expansion of Poe's reputation. People begin to recognize Poe as more than just a poet. In fact, the poetry becomes far less important than the stories. This is a 1903 image from Arthur Becker, who is German, and of course it's an illustration of the Pit and the Pendulum. And those of you who know that short story, you remember that at a crucial point in the narrative, the hapless narrator is tied to a bed. You can see the rope around him. And while he's tied to a bed and drugged, a scimitar comes down from the ceiling in the form of a pendulum that is also a sharp blade. And if you look carefully in this image, you can see here that it's already created a cut. There's already blood that's on the narrator's chest. But I was especially interested over here, the images of all these things painted on the wall that are also part of Poe's short story, creating perhaps a juxtaposition with the narrator's brain, with his head. These are images that perhaps he's seeing in his brain, or perhaps they're meant to anticipate where he's about to go in the destruction of his mortal self. Right? Images that perhaps those of you who know Hieronymus Bosch, that perhaps were close to that, the urbanscapes of Bosch here, with this kind of witch-like figure, and of course these skeletons as well, but the city aflame. Somebody, some sort of demon riding a witch's broom here too. So again, you know, the way in which Poe turns into the horror writer and moves away from the romantic, ethereal creator of beautiful sorrow to just a focus on the nightmare. This is Edmund Dulac, who in 1912 did a series of wonderful paintings on Poe's poem, The Bells. So I don't want to mislead you, even though Poe's poetry became less important as you move into the 20th century, it was still important, especially poems like The Raven and the Bells. And here is Dulac's image that brings together both the poem, but also Poe's ability to create horror within his poems. This is the frontispiece from The Bells. And there's another image that I'm going to show you here also from, this is also from Edmund Dulac. This is the image of The Bells where there's a fire going on below. The Bells is a poem that takes us through the course of a series of urban experiences that are connected to church bells. And in this particular image, you've got the idea of a fire that's raging below in the city streets. And perhaps these are the discorporated bodies that are being burned, or just the pain that's associated with the fire, the flames coming up. You see the smoke down here. This cathedral tower was actually in Dulac's town, where he grew up. I'm trying to think. I think it was in Germany. I can't remember exactly where his background is. It might also be England, somewhere in the UK. I'd have to look that up again. Sorry, I don't remember. Moving through the 19th century, we get to another one of Poe's great illustrators by the name of Harry Clarke. Clarke did this version of Poe's story Descent into the Maelstrom in 1919. It's a wonderful short story where some fishermen get caught outside the coast of Norway in a giant whirlpool, and their boat gets swept into the center of the whirlpool. And if you look over here, you can see the narrator of the story clinging to a barrel, because he realizes as he's watching and observing, much like one of Poe's detectives, that cylindrical objects tend to rise to the surface and do not get crushed like the boats will into the great maelstrom. So it's this figure of survival that Poe was writing about here, in the figure clinging desperately to the cask. This is again another Harry Clarke. This is the Black Cat, a return back to that figure. Those of you who don't know that story, the narrator of the tale, because of his psychological disposition and his alcoholism, ends up killing his wife. He hits her in the head with an axe, and then he buries her behind the wall of his basement. Now, when he buries her, he thinks he's able to get away with murder. But what he doesn't know is that another cat has snuck into his burial place. And you can see here the image of the woman after she's been discorporated for several days, and the cat itself. Around here are the policemen who have arrived because they've heard screams in the night. And everything looks like he's going to be able to get away with this. They don't notice the wall, they don't notice the basement, but suddenly they hear the scream of the cat, which again maybe brings us back to that Blumenschein image of that hat and its open mouth, anticipating the cat who will eventually give away the crime of the narrator. Almost a kind of crucifixion that's at work here too. But these are the police that are here. And if I could just say a few things about Clark's attention to a kind of, almost a kind of Rococo design with the garments that the people wear. They're almost like they're star clusters. And this is true for all of the work that he did on Edgar Allan Poe. He created these almost magical figures that appear, even as he's, of course, again, being like most of the 20th century illustrators, being very careful to remind us of the horror that's at work here. Okay, again, moving a little further along into the 20th century, we get to 1935. 1935 and the production of maybe Poe's greatest single illustrator. His name is Arthur Rackham, Rackham. And Rackham began as an Irish fairy tale illustrator. He was brought up and raised in Ireland and did wonderful work with fairy tales. And near the end of his life, he discovered Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think it's a coincidence that he discovered Poe about the same time in 1835 that we have the rise of fascism, because Rackham so often was fascinated with these images of Poe that suggest punishment of innocent people, like the Telltale Heart, for instance, and I'll show you that in a minute. But this is an image from the Fall of the House of Usher that Rackham produced in 1835, and very different kind of approach to the Fall of the House of Usher, almost as though the Usher mansion has taken on elements that remind us almost of a prison, or perhaps a grain elevator, as it's sitting, resting in the tarn. This is the narrator who shows up and has to witness the events that are taking place inside there. But it's a late October, and you see that the trees are blasted, no leaves, and almost figures of ghost-like elements that are kind of finding their way into these trees. And this is the narrator looking at the Usher mansion before he enters inside. Rackham did, I would be tempted to say Rackham must have done about 25 of these illustrations of Poe. And because he's so important and because he did such great work, we decided to give him an entire chapter of the book, which I think was very appropriate, because he's without a doubt the most important, I think, of all of Poe's illustrators in the history of Poe illustration. This is the cover of the book that I've been referring you to, and I wanted to show you another Rackham. This is The Pit and the Pendulum, and Rackham here is producing, again, the figure who is just about near the end of the story and discovers, much to his horror, that there's a huge pit in the center of the cell that he inhabits. And around him are all of these images, much like Becker, these images of monstrosity that haunt the perimeters of this. This is another Rackham. And you can see, if you look over here carefully, you can see how he was always fascinated with fairy tales and images of almost creatures. Yeah. This is another Rackham, an illustration from the Telltale Heart. And I'm sure many of you already know that. It's, again, a tale about a man who commits the crime, murders an old man in his own bed. And then because they've heard a scream, the police have arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning. And here is the man who's committed the murder trying to dissuade the police from not noticing what's underneath the floorboards. This figure of the discorporated victim who's been cut up with this knife. Pretty grisly image, isn't it? But they're sitting here having a glass of wine as he's quietly going through intense psychological distress because the police are sitting there testing him and interacting with him, and he wants them gone. So again, notice the difference here between the 19th century and its images of romantic beauty and the 20th century and its focus on the details of horror and violence. The level of violence increases as we move into the 20th century, the appreciation of that quality in Poe. Another Rackham, this one from the Cask of Amontillado, also done 1935. Fortunato has been tricked to come down into the crypt that belongs to Montresor's family. And because he's had a little bit too much Amontillado, he doesn't notice that Montresor is chaining him to the wall and is about to have him join the skeletons that are over here on the left. You see him with the mortar in his hand, the pestle, and he's walling up this figure who's going to die. And here we have Montresor's face of an image of arrogance and torment as he finally concludes his revenge against Fortunato, who's not terribly fortunate. Okay, so this takes you, moving forward again, this takes you to our present day. This is an illustrator by the name of Lynn Barnes, who did this rendition that she calls Poe's Last Supper. This was done in 2017, and this is Poe on his deathbed in Baltimore, Baltimore Presbyterian Hospital, where Poe, sorry, didn't mean to do that. See if I can get that back. Yeah, where Poe eventually expired in October 1849, October 7th, 1849. And if you look carefully here, what Lynn has done brilliantly, I think, is to capture all of Poe's major characters and to put them almost in bed with Poe himself. Here's a glass of anestet, not anestet. What am I thinking of here? Absinthe, sorry, absinthe that Poe is going to be able to imbibe. Here is I think this is the executioner from The Pit and the Pendulum. Here's a barkeep feeding Poe a living heart, Edgar Allan Poe. Over here, Hop Frog from that short story. Jupiter from the Goldbug. Let's see, Ligeia over here. Images of the ghostly woman that we've seen already from Poe's poetry, but especially Ligeia. Again, the seascape here, Annabel Lee. Over here, the Goldbug again, but perhaps also over here, the figure of Arthur Gordon Pym with his turtle from Poe's only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. So all these interesting images. And of course, if you look over here, you see all these cards floating around, the bells up here. But these cards floating around because Poe was a gambler and wasted a lot of money when he was in college with cards and would eventually write about gambling to some degree. Okay, this is one of my students, who unfortunately gave me these incredible drawings, pen and ink drawings, when the book was in press. So I wasn't able to include him in it. But here is my student, whose name is Alex Lumina, from The Masque of the Red Death. This was done this past year. And all these figures from The Masque of the Red Death, who are part of Prince Prospero's castle, avoiding, if you will, the plague, because Poe wrote this story about the plague of 1818, the cholera plague that literally beset the entire east coast of the United States. Another one of Lumina's paintings, drawings. This is from The Raven. I pulled this image from the internet in the last chapter, I spent a lot of time talking about the way in which Poe has become such a ubiquitous presence in both film, television, but also on the internet. And I really was attracted to this because, of course, you've got all these ravens here, that image of Poe that's so clearly identified, that creates this Poe's physiognomy. Now, one thing that happens when you're talking about the great illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe, it goes on. I mean, nobody ever stops illustrating Poe, right up to our present day. But what's interesting to note is that somewhere around the 1950s or so, Poe's characters are displaced by Poe himself. Poe's face becomes the figure that finds its way most often into illustrative work. And sometimes it's Poe's face who finds its way into the stories, so that Poe becomes almost the narrator in the stories in the hands of the illustrators. Many films created from the work of Edgar Allan Poe. This is a lost film, which means it no longer exists, but this was a film that came out in the early part of the 20th century. I think it's the first decade of the 20th century. And The Raven was one of the early films, but all through the 20th century, Poe, there's over 100 films that have been made of Poe's work. And if you look carefully here, you see some of the people who are in this film. This is Boris Karloff, who in the 1930s was the face and body of Frankenstein. Here's Basil Rathbone, who also had a role in a lot of the American international pictures. This is Vincent Price, right here. In the 1960s, a director by the name of Roger Corman did about a dozen or so films based on Edgar Allan Poe's work, and really brought attention to the popular culture to Edgar Allan Poe's work, but also to Vincent Price, whose career was fading fast until they started making these films. But if I could also draw your attention over here to the name Jack Nicholson. This is Jack Nicholson's first film. Oh, sorry. Keep touching that. Jack Nicholson's first film was this version of The Raven, which came out in 1964, I think, 1965. He's got a very small role in it, but it was his very first film. Okay, so I told you that we keep seeing images of Poe all through the present day. And these are some of my favorites. These are from a cartoonist by the name of Gahan Wilson. Gahan Wilson is very famous. He's done a lot of work in the New Yorker and in Playboy magazine, almost always carrying a kind of gothic or grotesque element to the images that he creates. And he did a whole series on The Raven and other poems that came out in the 70s that were published by Saddleback. and classics illustrated. And this is one of those images, and I'll give you another one here. Again, see, notice that we've got Poe here. It's Poe's face who becomes the figure of the narrator in The Raven. And this is not uncommon. All through the illustrations that happen in the last part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And I think I wanted to end with this image here. This is in very close to the center of Boston, Massachusetts. It was a statue to Edgar Allan Poe that was erected about 10 or 15 years ago. And it's very close to the train station, featuring Poe arriving in Boston to give a lecture. And his suitcase is open, as you can see here, and out of it is coming the Raven. But also right behind, if you look carefully here, it's a brilliant image because out of the suitcase are also tumbling Poe's papers and books right down here. And I don't know how well you can see it over here, but the artist has created in the brickwork itself pages from Poe's work that are somehow sealed inside the brickwork that's right here. So that as Poe is running from this train station, you can see his hair back there, he's dropping all of these wonderful pieces of literature that are falling out of his suitcase. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Tony. That was so interesting, so wonderful.
My pleasure.
The illustrations are so intriguing, and it's lovely to see how they remain so still so relevant. I think. I wonder if we're going to see a resurgence maybe of Poe and Poe illustrations, given the current plague. Something like the Mask of the Red Death seems very relevant right about now.
And also the Sphinx. The Sphinx is another one of Poe's stories that deals with mass contagion. Yeah. I think that's very interesting, the way Poe anticipates this with with that cholera epidemic that he witnessed firsthand.
We have lots of congratulations to Mr. Magistrale for his excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And lots of comments on the wonderful illustrations that you showed us.
Can I ask one question?
Of course.
Yes.
Tony, I'm thinking some of these illustrations seem very surreal. So yeah. I'm wondering, like the eyeball floating in the sky with a head underneath, is there a connection to surrealism? And what about the time sequence when surrealism was in its heyday versus these illustrations? Could you comment just a bit?
Sure, my pleasure. You'll remember at one point early in my talk, I mentioned that one thing that I learned in writing this book was the way in which the artists were not only influenced by Poe's work and their interpretation of Poe's work, but also in the historical framework / context of when they were producing their art. So that when you look at somebody like Doré, for example, or even Manet, you're seeing, especially that last print of Manet, you're seeing almost as though he were anticipating the rise of symbolism. With some of the paintings that we see appearing in 1909 and the early 20s, we have anticipation of surrealism. So that you get I would say you get a painting like, for example, not so much Rodin, because Rodin is at the end of the 19th century. I think Rodin maybe anticipates surrealism, but a painter like Blumenschein was right in the heart of it. And of course, even somebody like Rackham would have understood and appreciated the importance of surrealism a decade before he created his Poe work.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question from Pablo Espinosa.
Okay, Pablo, hello.
Hello, do you listen to me?
Yes.
Thank you for your exposition. And I would like to make, I think, a suggestion maybe. I think it could be very interesting to add a chapter dedicated to the illustrators from Latin America.
Yes.
Because Edgar Allan Poe was translated by a very important Argentinian writer called Julio Cortázar. So in Latin America, it's very appreciated. And I think there's a lot of version, especially in comic. And a good example, I think, is Alberto Breccia. He's from Uruguay. He has a great comic book of Poe and also of Lovecraft. I think horror stories are very important in American and Latin American.
Yes.
And Poe is very, very well appreciated. So that's, I think it could be a very great chapter of your investigation. I would love to see more illustrators from Latin America, because all you show is really amazing. And I think there's also great illustrators from here.
I couldn't agree more. Again, I would have liked this book to have been 3 times as long as it is. And it's not only Latin America and Chile in particular, but also Japanese and Russian as well, did a series of wonderful paintings and drawings of Poe's work. It's just that I was limited by space. I could only do a certain number of them, and these were the ones that seemed to me to be especially important to the Poe canon. But I agree completely, Pablo. If there's a flaw in this book, it's that it's too limited.
Yes, of course, I understand. I recommend you Alberto Breccia, very, very good illustrator of Poe from Uruguay.
Could you spell that for me, Pablo?
Maybe
It's
write it down on the chat, Pablo.
Okay.
All right, I will write it down.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you.
People
Thanks
think
to
of
you.
other questions. I think that'd be a great idea to have a second volume of
Yeah,
to add your students.
Let's sell this one first.
Yeah, we're absolutely going to buy it at the library, because we need to see these wonderful illustrators. I knew most of them, but some of them were wonderful discoveries. So I'd absolutely take a look at that. Jesus,
And of course, don't forget, I could only give you an hour's worth of work here.
of
There's
course,
a lot more here from the illustrators I told you about, but also from illustrators that I did not mention yet.
I can imagine that. Jesus says, could you please repeat the name of the artist who painted Poe's Last Supper, please?
Her name is Lynn, Lynn Barnes, Barnes. Lynn Barnes.
Good. Thank you so much. And I have more questions for you.
Yeah.
Can I, Rocio, please?
Hi. I just wanted to ask you, Anthony, like, what is kind of your favorite style, or from all the arts that you've studied, like, which one do you think can, in a way, portray the best, or at least in a way that you like the most?
Well, that's a hard question, Rocio. I'd probably say that the one that intrigued me the most of all of them was probably Arthur Rackham, because Rackham did such an extensive array of work. As I mentioned to you, perhaps 25 or 30 illustrations of various Poe work, and it's almost as if they're all so different from one another. Even though they have that kind of cartoon-like quality to them, they're very, very different. So I would have to say that Rackham probably stood out for me the most of all the illustrators that I studied.
And Rackham really was for me so closely associated to the fairy tales.
Yes.
That sort of came out as a pleasant surprise.
Absolutely. Look, would you all do me a favor? Would you all come out from behind your doors so I could see your beautiful faces?
That's what I keep asking my students to do. See if you have a,
Well, I tried doing it and it wouldn't let me turn my video on. I don't know why everybody is blank. When they ask questions, I'd like to see the people instead of their picture or a dog.
Oh, here comes some people.
thank you.
Yes, here.
You've been very successful at this. You know how many times I've asked in class?
There they are.
I'm going to say, well, if you
Good.
turn on your camera for Anthony, why not for me? And then I'm going to get offended. Roxana, you have a question.
Yes, hello. I have two quick questions. First, I wanted to ask, what motivated you? Like, what was the original kind of the point of origin of this project? Like, where did it come from, more or less?
Well, again, going back five or so years ago, I started to. I've always been a Poe scholar. I've written several books about Edgar Allan Poe, and so I came across some of these illustrations early on in my own work. But I had this student, Jess Slayton, who eventually became my co-author in writing this book. You can see Jess's name down here. And Jess decided she wanted to write her master's thesis on Rackham, on Arthur Rackham, and his connection not only to Poe, but also to fairy tales. And so I directed her thesis. I helped guide her in her thesis writing. And the two of us started talking about, this is such an amazing project because she did a great job. And I said, what if we were to write a book based on this? Because there are so many. I had no idea there were this many. I had no idea there were 700 illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe. But that's what it was, this collaboration between this very, very excellent student and myself that got us writing. So in a way, she wrote the first part of this book in writing her master's thesis on Arthur Rackham. And it's a tribute, I think it's more than anything else, it's a tribute to the way in which students often influence their professors, the way in which you bring to us a new knowledge or a new excitement. And that's not paid attention to enough. The role you have in our lives. We know the role we have in your lives. We get paid to do that. That's what we get paid for. But what you give back to us is often just as important.
I really like that thought. That's a lovely way of putting it. And
it started with her. It really started with her more than anything. And then I got a sabbatical and I started writing about, I started doing the French. I was really interested in what Manet contributed to this whole thing, because Manet is, I don't know if any of you are aware of the importance that Manet has in the history of art, but Manet is one of the great artists of all time. Really, the first artist who went to the city and decided that this was going to be the subject of his art, the urban world. And that's always fascinated me.
Roxana, you have a second question, and then yes. I think Antonia had her hand up.
Sure. Yes, thank you so much for your answer. That's actually, like Ms. Francisca said, that's actually a really lovely thought. So thank you so much for that. Sure. And my second question was, you've mentioned that what appealed about Poe to artists throughout the centuries, throughout the decades, has changed. Like originally it was his romanticism, and later it was like the psychological implications of his work. So would you say that what has appealed to people, because Poe is still very ubiquitous to this day, would you say that what appeals to people, and especially artists, about Poe is that they're constantly discovering new things about him, like it's always something different that strikes them? Or is there something like inherently timeless about Poe's work? Is it like one quality that just stays, endures?
That's a really rich and detailed question. Could I say that it's both? That on one hand, there's a universal property that's at work in Poe's fiction that connects him to all great artists of all time, that he's telling stories about people and morality and motivations, but that there's also various periods. If you look at the history of sorry. If you look at the history of Poe scholarship, you'll see that there are certain works that had dominance over others. Like, for example, in the 19th century, it was the poetry that had the most interest. When you get to the 20th century, it's not until the 1950s that Poe's novel gets attention. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym really doesn't get any attention from anybody until the 1950s, 1960s. So why was that? Why was a novel, Poe's only novel, essentially ignored until 1950? And I suspect some of it had to do with the fact that it's probably Poe's most racially charged book. So that when you get to the 60s and the 50s and the 60s, especially in America, you're seeing a dramatic fascination and interest with civil rights and racial issues. So Pym suddenly takes on this enormous energy and this enormous attention, to the point of where Pym becomes the single most important work that people are writing about in the 50s and the 60s. So it depends, like the artists themselves, as I mentioned to you, the artists themselves that are shaped by the artistic movements that they're part of. I think when you talk about a writer like Poe, or maybe any writer for that matter, what's important that's going on around him is somehow shaping what's going on in his canon too, the attention that's going on in his canon.
Thank you so much for your answer. And thank you so much for the talk as well.
You're welcome, Rosalita. You're welcome.
Thank you. Antonia, do you still have your question?
No, it was the same as Roxana's. So thank you for the answer already. It was like, what motivated you, and like how maybe I just can't reformulate it, because yeah, what was like the first story that you read of Poe, and like that made you think, yeah, I like it, I love him, I relate to him, or I want to write about him? Like, what was it? Maybe in your childhood or your?
I think everybody meets Poe early on. I met Poe through an aunt that I was spending a lot of time with, who wanted to read me stories. She was a history teacher in Buffalo, New York, which is next to Niagara Falls. That you know. And she was a history teacher at a school there, and she introduced me to Poe by reading, and I would just sit there and listen to the Telltale Heart and the other works. And that's I think that's where it started. We meet Poe young, maybe not a healthy thing, but we meet Poe, we meet Poe young, and I think we're drawn to him. Well, let me just tell you a quick story. Every year, I teach a course in American literature, much like yours, I think, and I start off by having them read the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Margaret Fuller. We read the early colonialists like Ben Franklin. And somewhere around week 7 or 8, we do Poe. something happens to the class. Maybe because it's close to Halloween, but something happens to the class. What often becomes this turns into, I have much to say here. I have much to say here. And then I think that's the energy that Poe gives to his literature. And that's what probably appealed to me the most over my years as a teacher, is that there's some sort of synergy at work in Poe's work. Maybe it's the madness. Maybe it's the psychological trauma and the mental illness that Poe detailed so accurately and vividly. And then we have to go back to reading other work, and everybody goes back to sleep.
I love your answer. Can I add a really quick commentary? Yeah, is that I remember being 12 or 13 years old, and I've always been sensitive, really sensitive to things, and like I loved romance and kind of lovely stories. And then I had to read Poe for my literature class, and then I got really traumatized, and I was like, this raven thing, the cat thing, and I remember reading the cat thing. This guy is just so messed up, but I loved, I would be alone at my house, and I would be so silent, and I'm so scared, and that this imagination is amazing, but it's so horrible. And that led me to listen to your talk, because it was like, what make you write something about this? It was really incredible. But thank you for your answer. Well, I can relate to that.
It's very interesting that you should tell us that story from your autobiography, because I've had the occasion to interview Stephen King, and on one of those occasions he told me the exact same story almost about his introduction to Poe, that Poe had the same effect on him. And is it too much to suggest that Poe began this incredible career that has made Stephen King ubiquitous and famous? That it started with Poe.
Yeah, it's the same for us.
What you all have to remember here are two things. One, that Poe, unlike all of his American contemporaries, never had another job. He didn't work in the custom house like Hawthorne did. He wasn't a merchant mariner like Melville was. He wasn't a carpenter like Walt Whitman. He wasn't a famous lecturer like Emerson. Poe worked a hard scrabble life. And by that, I mean he had to earn everything, and he always was committed to literature. He made his living through literature, even though dollars damned him. And the second thing that I think is important is to know that he died with a sense of not being famous, with a sense of not being appreciated and not being read. If only Poe could see what he engendered, what he created. It's phenomenal. It reminds me a lot of Vincent van Gogh, who also died, without any sense of accomplishment, committed suicide. Poe tried to commit suicide. It just didn't work. He screwed it up. He had too much laudanum, and all it did was make him sick.
It is quite a mystery that they all become famous afterwards, and it's like really unfair. But yeah, I feel you totally.
But on the other hand, there's hope for all of us.
Yes, you're right. we will be appreciated in the future. Later Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Tony, I don't know if there are any other questions, or we'll just let you go with these final inspirational words of wisdom. I think we all really, really enjoyed your talk, and it's gonna stay with us for a long time.
Well, I'm just delighted to be back in Santiago again. Seriously, I know it's virtual, but I had such a good time there. And I learned so many important things. Like, for example, there is no such thing as Chilean sea bass. There are sea basses. I went to the first restaurant I went to in Santiago. I love Chilean sea bass. And the waiter looked at me and said, which one? Who knew?
You knew, yes.
But you guys, just like it was 7 years ago, it's delightful seeing your faces and watching you get excited about Poe and being so polite with me. Thank you for inviting me into your world. I hope I can see you sometime in person.
That would be lovely.
Especially Francisca. I want very much to see you again soon.
That would be fantastic. Let's hope that's the case soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Brenny, for hosting the session. And I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.